Before we delve into this gripping narrative, please share in the comments where you're tuning in from to experience this poignant tale, the night that changed everything. It was a bitterly cold evening in late autumn, the kind where the air cut through layers of clothing, seeping into your bones. The streetlights flickered dimly, casting eerie shadows along the quiet suburban street. Most of the houses were dark, their occupants having long since retreated indoors, seeking warmth and comfort. But in one particular house, hidden behind drawn curtains and locked doors, a different kind of coldness lingered. A silence so thick it carried the weight of unspoken words, broken trust, and lingering fear. Maya sat in the corner of her bedroom, hugging her knees, her small frame trembling, not from the cold, but from something far worse. At just 8 years old, she had already learned that fear could come in many forms. Sometimes it was loud, full of shouting and slammed doors. Other times, it was quiet, creeping in like a shadow, whispering doubts in the stillness of the night. Tonight, it was the latter. She could hear her father moving about downstairs, his heavy footsteps a stark contrast to the silence that followed. It had been one of those nights again, the kind where the tension in the air became unbearable, where words turned into weapons, where the echoes of anger lingered long after the voices had gone quiet. Her mother, Aisha, had tried to shield her from it. She always did. But there were some things that no mother could truly protect her child from. Things Maya had seen and heard far too many times. The creak of the stairs made her breath hitch in her throat. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her hands over her ears. Maybe if she pretended hard enough, she could make herself disappear. Maybe she could will the night to end before it got any worse. But reality had a cruel way of shattering illusions. The door swung open, and there he stood, her father Daniel. His face was shadowed, but Maya didn't need to see his expression to know what was coming. The smell of alcohol clung to him, mixing with the bitter scent of cigarettes and something else, something that made her stomach twist. "Maya," he said, his voice unusually calm. Too calm. "Come here." She hesitated, clutching her knees tighter. A warning flashed in his eyes, and she knew better than to disobey. With slow, reluctant movements, she stood up, her tiny hands trembling at her sides. "Come with me," he said, reaching for her wrist. "Where are we going?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled her along, his grip firm but not painful, at least not yet. She cast a desperate glance toward the closed door of her parents' bedroom. Her mother was in there, exhausted from crying, exhausted from fighting a battle that never seemed to end. Maya wanted to call out, to scream, to run. But she didn't, because she had learned that sometimes silence was the only way to survive. The front door swung open, letting in the bitter night air. Maya shivered, her breath coming out in small, visible puffs. Her father led her outside, his grip tightening slightly as they stepped onto the porch. It was dark. Too dark. The only source of light came from the flickering street lamp at the end of the road, casting long, distorted shadows. The world outside was eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. "Stay here," he said suddenly, releasing her wrist. Maya's heart pounded. "But," "I said stay here." His voice was sharp, cutting through the night. And then, without another word, he turned and walked back inside, closing the door behind him. Maya stood frozen, confusion and fear warring within her. The wind howled, rustling the trees, making their branches creak like old bones. She wrapped her arms around herself, rubbing her bare arms for warmth. The thin pajamas she wore did little to shield her from the biting cold. Minutes passed. Then more. The porch light remained off. The house was silent. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. He wasn't coming back. Her father had locked her out. Her tiny fists pounded against the door, her voice breaking as she called out for him, for her mother, for anyone. But there was no answer. Only the cruel, suffocating silence of the night. Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to cry. She had cried too many times before, and it had never changed anything. Instead, she turned around, staring at the empty street, at the vast, endless darkness stretching before her. She had never felt so alone. Inside the house, Aisha stirred in her sleep, her dreams haunted by echoes of past arguments, by the weight of her reality. But then, a sound, a faint, distant sound. Crying. Her eyes snapped open. She sat up abruptly, her heart racing. The room was dark, save for the pale sliver of moonlight filtering through the curtains, but something felt wrong. An unease settled in her chest, like a whisper of warning. And then she heard it again. A muffled sob. A child's cry. Maya. Aisha's breath caught in her throat. She threw the blanket off and rushed toward the door, her hands trembling as she turned the knob. The hallway was silent. Too silent. Her feet barely made a sound as she hurried down the stairs, her pulse hammering. She reached Maya's bedroom, pushing the door open. Empty. Panic gripped her. Maya. Her voice cracked. No response. Aisha turned toward the front door, dread pooling in her stomach. She fumbled with the lock, her hand shaking so violently that it took her several tries before she managed to wrench the door open. And there, standing on the porch, was Maya. The sight made Aisha's heart shatter. Her daughter stood barefoot on the freezing concrete, her thin pajamas offering no protection against the bitter cold. Her arms were wrapped tightly around herself, her small frame shaking, but it was her face that made Aisha's breath catch in her throat. Tears had streaked down Maya's cheeks, freezing in the cold. Her lips were trembling, her eyes wide with something beyond fear. Something broken. Aisha fell to her knees, pulling Maya into her arms, holding her close. The little girl clung to her, burying her face in her mother's shoulder. Aisha felt rage and sorrow and guilt crash over her in waves. How had she let this happen? How had she allowed the man she once loved to do this to their daughter? Enough. That single word echoed in her mind. This was the breaking point, the moment where everything would change. Aisha didn't know how, but one thing was certain. She would never, never let this happen again. And for the first time in a long time, she felt something stir within her. Determination. Because she would fight. Not just for herself, but for Maya. For the daughter who had spent too many nights in fear. For the little girl who deserved a future filled with warmth, with safety, with love. This was the night everything changed. This was the night she chose to fight back. The road to somewhere. Aisha didn't sleep that night. Even after she wrapped Maya in warm blankets, even after she held her close until her tiny body stopped trembling, even after her daughter's exhausted sobs turned into slow, steady breathing. Aisha didn't close her eyes. She couldn't. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall, her thoughts running in circles like a caged animal. The weight of everything pressed down on her chest, heavy and suffocating. How had it come to this? How had she let it get so bad? She had spent years making excuses, telling herself that things would change, that Daniel wasn't always this way, that the man she had fallen in love with was still somewhere inside the stranger he had become. She had told herself that she had to stay for Maya's sake, that a broken home was worse than a broken marriage. But tonight had shattered every illusion she had left. No child should ever have to stand in the cold, locked out of their own home. No child should ever look at their mother with silent, pleading eyes, begging for protection without saying a single word. Aisha reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from Maya's face. Even in sleep, her daughter's brow was furrowed, as if she were bracing for something. Another fight, another harsh word, another night of uncertainty. Something inside Aisha hardened. She wouldn't let this happen again. For years she had been afraid. Afraid of the unknown, of starting over, of what Daniel might do if she left. But now, a different fear took root inside her. The fear of what would happen if she stayed. She glanced at the clock on the bedside table. 4:27 a.m. The house was still, silent, but she knew that silence was fragile, that it could shatter the moment Daniel woke up. She wouldn't wait for that to happen. Moving carefully, Aisha stood up. Every movement felt deliberate, heavy with purpose. She walked to the closet and pulled out a suitcase. It was old, tucked away beneath forgotten boxes, left unused because she had convinced herself she would never need it. But tonight, it was a lifeline. Her hands moved quickly, methodically. She packed Maya's clothes first. Warm sweaters, soft leggings, her favorite stuffed bear that she couldn't sleep without. Then she grabbed the essentials. Documents, cash she had hidden away over time, anything they would need for the days ahead. As she folded the last of Maya's things into the suitcase, her daughter stirred. "Mama." Her voice was groggy, confused. Aisha turned to her, smoothing a gentle hand over her hair. "Shh, baby. We're leaving." Maya blinked, trying to shake off sleep. "Leaving?" Aisha nodded. "We're going somewhere safe." For a moment, Maya was silent. Then, something in her expression changed. She didn't ask where. She didn't ask why. She just reached for her mother's hand and held on tight. She understood. The early morning air was sharp and cold as Aisha quietly shut the front door behind them. She clutched the suitcase in one hand, Maya's small fingers wrapped around the other. Her heart pounded so loudly, she thought it might wake the entire neighborhood. They had to move quickly. She didn't have a car. Daniel had taken away that privilege years ago, claiming she didn't need it. But that didn't matter now. The bus stop was a few blocks away. If she could just get there, they could leave before he even realized they were gone. Maya walked beside her without complaint, though her tiny feet struggled to keep up. She was still half asleep, her little body leaning into Aisha for warmth. "We're almost there, baby," Aisha whispered. The bus stop came into view, illuminated by the dim glow of a nearby streetlight. Relief flooded her chest as she checked the schedule posted on the metal pole. The next bus arrived in 20 minutes. They could make it. Aisha set the suitcase down and wrapped her arms around Maya, pulling her close. "Are you okay?" she asked gently. Maya nodded, though her face was still buried against her mother's coat. Aisha pressed a kiss to her forehead. "We're going to be okay," she promised. But before the words had even fully left her lips, a sound cut through the quiet of the morning. The unmistakable slam of a car door. Her stomach twisted. Slowly, she turned her head. And there, standing beneath the streetlight, was Daniel. For a moment, everything froze. Daniel stood perfectly still, his face half shadowed by the dull orange glow above him. His eyes locked onto hers, unreadable, emotionless in a way that sent a shiver down Aisha's spine. Her grip on Maya tightened instinctively. He took a step forward. "Aisha." His voice was calm. Too calm. She had heard that tone before. It was the same one he used before the storm hit. "Where are you going?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. Aisha forced herself to stand tall, even though her knees felt weak. "We're leaving." Daniel let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "Leaving?" He let out a humorless chuckle. "You think you can just walk away? Just like that?" She didn't answer. He took another step forward. "You're making a mistake." "No," she said firmly. "I made a mistake staying this long." Daniel's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "Aisha, don't do this." A bus appeared in the distance, its headlights cutting through the dark. Aisha's pulse quickened. This was it. She bent down and scooped Maya into her arms. "I'm not doing this for me, Daniel. I'm doing it for her." For the first time, something flickered in his eyes, something that looked almost like fear. The bus pulled up with a soft hiss, the doors swinging open. Aisha didn't hesitate. She grabbed the suitcase, stepped onto the bus, and didn't look back. The doors closed behind her. And just like that, she was free. As the bus rolled forward, Aisha let out a shaky breath. She pressed Maya close to her chest, listening to the rhythmic hum of the engine. They had done it. They had left. Maya lifted her head, blinking sleepily. "Where are we going, Mama?" Aisha swallowed hard. The truth was, she didn't know. She had no real plan, no clear destination. But for the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. She kissed the top of Maya's head, her heart swelling with fierce determination. "Somewhere better," she whispered. And with that, they disappeared into the morning light. A new beginning, a fragile hope. The bus rumbled forward, its headlights slicing through the fading darkness of early morning. The hum of the engine and the rhythmic sway of the vehicle should have been soothing, but Aisha's heart was pounding too fast, her thoughts racing too wildly to feel any sense of calm. She had done it. She had left. But now what? She sat in the middle of the bus, Maya curled up against her, the little girl's fingers still gripping the fabric of her coat, as though she feared her mother might disappear if she let go. Aisha gently stroked Maya's hair, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "You're safe now, baby," she whispered, more to convince herself than her daughter. The other passengers barely glanced at them. An old woman with a knitted scarf sat near the front, staring out the window. A tired-looking man in a construction uniform rubbed his face, yawning. A young woman with headphones tapped her fingers against her knee. To them, Aisha and Maya were just two more strangers in the world. But to Aisha, this moment was the most terrifying and exhilarating one of her life. She had no plan, no destination, just a suitcase, a few bills tucked into her pocket, and a determination stronger than fear. Aisha took a slow, deep breath, steeling herself. She had left Daniel behind. That was the hardest step. Now, she had to take the next one. But where would they go? She pulled her phone from her coat pocket, hesitating for only a second before unlocking it. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through her contacts. There was only one person she could call. She pressed the name. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Then, Aisha. A groggy, confused voice answered. Tears burned in her eyes at the sound of it. "Auntie Haw," she choked out. The silence on the other end was brief, but heavy with understanding. "Where are you?" Aisha swallowed. "I don't know. I'm on a bus." Another pause. Then, a voice full of quiet urgency. "Come to me. Whatever you need, I'm here." Relief flooded her so fast it nearly took her breath away. She had a place to go. They weren't alone. For the first time in what felt like forever, hope didn't just whisper, it roared. The arrival. The bus ride was long. Hours stretched like eternity, but Aisha stayed awake the entire time, watching over Maya as she slept. When they finally arrived at the city's main station, the sun was fully up, casting golden light over the world that felt strangely foreign. Aisha stepped off the bus, holding Maya close. Her daughter stirred, blinking sleepily. "Mama, where are we?" she murmured. "Somewhere safe, baby," Aisha assured her, scanning the crowd. And then, a familiar figure emerged, a woman in her late 40s, with dark, kind eyes and a warm expression that had always felt like home. Auntie Hawa. Aisha's breath hitched. She hadn't seen her aunt in years, not since Daniel had isolated her from the few people who still cared about her. But the moment their eyes met, it was as if time had never passed. Aisha barely had time to whisper, "Auntie," before she was pulled into a tight, bone-crushing embrace. "My girl," Hawa murmured, voice thick with emotion. "You're home." The words shattered something inside Aisha. She felt her knees buckle, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to lean on someone else. A fragile first step. Hawa's apartment was small but filled with warmth. The scent of fresh bread and spices lingered in the air, wrapping around Aisha like a comforting embrace. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, while Maya curled up on the couch, already half asleep again. Hawa sat across from her, eyes filled with quiet understanding. "You don't have to say anything," she said softly. "I know." Aisha let out a shaky breath. "I should have left years ago," she admitted, shame curling in her stomach. Hawa reached across the table, taking her hand. You left when you were ready, she said firmly. And that's all that matters. Aisha nodded, though the weight of her choices still pressed down on her. Hawa squeezed her fingers. What do you need? Aisha exhaled slowly. A fresh start. A job. A place for Maya. Hawa didn't hesitate. We'll figure it out. You have a home here. For as long as you need. Aisha's throat tightened. I don't want to be a burden. Hawa gave her a knowing look. Your family. You're not a burden. You've done enough surviving, Aisha. Now it's time to live. Tears slipped down Aisha's cheeks, but this time they weren't from fear or exhaustion. They were from something new. Something terrifying, yet exhilarating. Freedom. Aisha had spent years thinking that leaving Daniel was impossible, that she had no way out. But now, as she sat in a warm kitchen, her daughter safe and asleep in the next room, she realized the truth. She had taken the first step, and she wasn't walking alone. She was moving forward. And for the first time, in a long, long time, she truly believed that better days were ahead. Rebuilding from the ashes. The first morning in Auntie Hawa's apartment felt unreal. For the first time in years, Aisha woke up to silence. Not the kind that made her heart race with fear, but the kind that wrapped around her like a gentle embrace. No shouting. No slamming doors. No feeling of dread curling in her stomach. She sat up slowly, blinking at the unfamiliar but welcoming space. The room was small but cozy, the pale morning light filtering through the curtains, casting a warm glow. Beside her, Maya was still fast asleep, her tiny hands curled beneath her cheek, her breathing soft and even. For a long moment, Aisha just watched her. She looked peaceful, and for the first time in years, Aisha allowed herself to breathe. It was over. They were safe. But the real question was, what came next? The weight of the past. The smell of spiced tea and fresh bread drifted through the air, pulling Aisha out of bed. She tucked a blanket around Maya and padded quietly into the kitchen, where she found Auntie Hawa already at the stove, humming softly as she poured steaming cups of tea. Morning, my girl, Hawa said warmly, handing her a cup. Aisha wrapped her fingers around the warm ceramic, inhaling deeply. She hadn't realized how much she needed this, the simple comfort of a quiet morning, of a home that felt safe. How did you sleep? Hawa asked gently. Aisha hesitated, staring into the dark liquid. I don't know, she admitted. I kept waking up, expecting. She trailed off, shaking her head. Expecting him. Aisha nodded. Hawa sighed. It takes time, Aisha. After years of walking on eggshells, it's hard to remember what it feels like to just be. Aisha looked up. How did you do it? Hawa's eyes darkened, her fingers tightening around her cup. Aisha had always known her aunt had her own scars. Growing up, she had sensed it in the way Hawa never spoke about her past, in the way she flinched at sudden loud noises, in the way she always insisted on keeping a spare set of keys in her pocket, even inside her own home. You already know the answer, Hawa said softly. You survive. And then one day, you stop just surviving and start living. Aisha swallowed hard. And how do I do that? Hawa reached across the table, squeezing her hand. One step at a time, finding a way forward. Later that morning, while Maya played with a set of old stuffed animals Hawa had kept, Aisha sat on the couch, her phone in her hands. The screen felt heavier than it should have. Her old life, the one she had run from, was still trapped inside this tiny device. There were messages she hadn't read, numbers she didn't want to see. But she had to do this. With a deep breath, she opened her email and started searching. Jobs. She needed work. She scrolled through listings, chewing her lip. Before Daniel, she had been studying to become a teacher, but that dream had been crushed beneath the weight of his control. Now she had nothing. No degree. No recent work experience. But she had to start somewhere. And she would. She sent out applications, her fingers trembling slightly with each one. Some were for cleaning jobs, some for reception work, some for anything that would let her start over. When she was done, she let out a slow breath, pressing the phone to her forehead. It was a small step, but it was a step. Shadows of the past. That night, as she tucked Maya into bed, the little girl looked up at her with wide, serious eyes. "Will he find us?" she whispered. Aisha's breath caught. She knew exactly who Maya was talking about. She smoothed her daughter's hair, forcing a reassuring smile. "No, baby," she said softly. "He won't find us. We're safe." Maya hesitated. "What if he's angry?" Aisha's heart clenched. "It doesn't matter," she said firmly. "You and me, we're going to be okay. I promise." Maya stared at her for a long moment before finally nodding. She curled up under the blankets, hugging her stuffed bear close. Aisha stayed beside her until her breathing evened out, her tiny body relaxing into sleep. But Aisha didn't move. Because the truth was, she wasn't sure if her words were true. Daniel wasn't the kind of man who let things go. And she knew, deep in her bones, that one day, he would come looking. An unfinished battle. The next few days passed in a blur of cautious routine. Aisha and Maya settled into Auntie Hawa's home, trying to carve out a sense of normalcy. Aisha spent her mornings looking for work, sending out more applications. In the afternoons, she took Maya to the park, watching her daughter slowly rediscover her laughter. For the first time in a long time, Maya ran freely, her giggles echoing through the air as she played with other children. Aisha clutched her coat tighter around her, watching. This was what her daughter deserved. Not fear, not silence. Just this, laughter, freedom, childhood. But just as she started to believe they were safe, the past came knocking. It started with a phone call. A number she recognized but had forced herself to forget. Her stomach twisted as the phone buzzed in her hand. Daniel. Her fingers tightened around the device. She didn't answer. Then came the messages. At first, they were calm. "Come back, Aisha. Let's talk." Then, "You can't do this." And finally, "You'll regret this." Aisha's blood turned to ice. She put the phone on silent, shoving it into her pocket, her heart hammering. Daniel knew. He knew they were gone. And he wasn't going to let go so easily. She needed to be ready. Because the fight wasn't over yet. Not even close. The last door she closed. Aisha had always believed that fear had a voice. For years, it had spoken to her in whispers, soft, insidious, curling around her thoughts like smoke. "You can't leave him. You have nowhere to go. You'll never be free." But now, fear had a new voice, and it was screaming. The first sign that Daniel had found them came in the form of a car parked too long across the street. Hawa noticed it first. "That black sit-in," she murmured one evening, peering through the curtain. "It's been there since morning." Aisha's stomach clenched. It could be nothing. A coincidence. But deep down, she knew better. The messages had stopped 2 days ago. The silence felt heavier than the words he had sent before. Daniel wasn't the type to beg for long. He was the type to act. That night, Aisha barely slept. She sat in the dimly lit living room, watching the shadows stretch across the walls, listening for sounds that didn't belong. When the first knock came, she flinched. It was soft, measured. Then another. And another. A slow, deliberate rhythm. Her heart pounded as she crept toward the door. She didn't have to look through the peephole. She already knew. Still, her hands trembled as she lifted the curtain. There, standing in the pale glow of the porch light, was Daniel. His face was calm. Too calm. A chill ran down her spine. She turned, about to wake Hawa. But before she could move, his voice cut through the door. "I know you're in there, Aisha." Her breath caught. "I just want to talk," he said, his tone smooth, almost coaxing. "That's all." Aisha's hands balled into fists. Once upon a time, she would have believed him. She would have opened the door. She would have let him in. And then he would have reminded her, in the cruelest ways, that she didn't get to leave him. But Aisha wasn't that woman anymore. She took a slow breath. Then she did something she had never done before. She stepped away from the door and called the police. The moments that followed felt like they stretched into eternity. Daniel didn't leave. Instead, his voice dropped lower, more insistent. "Aisha, don't do this. I can forgive you, you know. I can take you back." She closed her eyes, pressing the phone to her ear. The operator's voice was calm, steady. "Officers are on their way, ma'am. Stay inside." And she did. For the first time, she didn't answer him. For the first time, she let the silence between them be hers to control. Daniel's voice hardened. "You think this is over?" Footsteps. A car door slamming. Tires screeching into the night. And then, nothing. Aisha exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. By the time the police arrived, Daniel was gone. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't running anymore. Because this time, she had done something she had never dared to do before. She had shut the door on him. And this time, she wasn't opening it again. The beginning of something new. The days that followed were a blur of reports and statements, restraining orders, safety plans, precautions. But through it all, Aisha felt something shift inside her. She was no longer a woman running from her past. She was a woman building a future. It wasn't easy. Healing never was. But each morning, as she watched Maya laugh, as she saw her daughter run freely, as she sat with Hawa drinking tea in the quiet peace of their home, she knew she had won. Not in the loud, triumphant way people imagined victories, but in the quiet, in the peace, in the simple act of waking up without fear. She had walked through the fire, and she had survived, not just for Maya, but for herself. And that was the most powerful thing of all. The last door she closed was the first step toward freedom.